And we're live. And with that, I shall turn over to Seth in his presentation.
Okay, so again, my name is Seth Kane. I'm technology lead at Critical Mass. I'm going to be talking about standards, design patterns, and ARI and a little bit more. Just to give you a little preface to like what this is going to be about, it's because I'm very technical, it's not going to be about that. I want this presentation to be engaging and thought-provoking. So if there's any time that you have a question or you want to provide some feedback or comments, whatever, I strongly encourage you just to raise your hand or interrupt. But my goal for this is for you as individuals interested in accessibility to be able to really start thinking about this rather than in your own discipline, but in a multidiscipline and more engaging effort to broaden your knowledge and your way to communicate the importance of this in various areas. So with that, I will start with standards. So I don't know if you can read that in the back. I wasn't expecting a 30-foot table, but basically standards is something set up and established by an authority as a rule for the measure of quantity, weight, extent, value, and quality. And I emphasize quality. I want us all to think about the beginning part of this presentation as more common elements in our real world and how we can apply simple understandings of things like standards to accessibility and other things as well. So some examples, standards can be found in almost every area of our daily lives. Some obvious ones are like things like stoplights, right? You know, just about every stoplight in the world works and looks and behaves this exact same way. In some countries, they flip them, left to right, but really it's either top to bottom and left to right, and that's why, the color isn't necessarily relevant because the red is always either at the top or the left, and that's a standard that's being followed internationally. Turn signal levers, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but where is your turn signal lever in your car? Raise the hand that you use to turn your turn signals on and off.
I have to think about that.
Okay, so most cars are on the outside of the steering wheel unless it's an internationally kind of type car. So like cars that are sold in both markets, they might be changed. But that's another standard that usually all car manufacturers will follow for usability purposes and things like that. Nuts and bolts is an obvious one, like lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. There aren't very many examples out there of nuts and bolts that don't follow that standard, so to speak. And I would imagine we could probably sit here for days and talk about various other ones. But those are some common elements of some things that really the rules are never really broken. It's things that just occur in our everyday lives. And with that note, are there web standards? Well, obviously the answer is yes, right? We all know that there's various ones, and some might be known and some might not be known. So just a quick reference, like the W3C, that's basically the organization that sets all the browser standards and some of the code standards and that we work with every day. There's a less known one. I don't even know how they pronounce it, so I'm just going to call it the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. They basically contribute to the W3C. They're like the workhorses of the W3C. They'll like actually say, hey, we want to do something different, and they'll start really investigating different types of things and determine if it can or can't be a standard, and then we'll present those ideas to the W3C. ISO, which is not really a web standard, but it's more of an internationally acclaimed, large organizational standards. If anybody's ever heard of ISO 9000 or 9001, some corporations, I'm guessing like United lives and breathes by that type of thing, and those standards can be actually applied into web technologies and processes and things like that as well. The ADA, ECMA, Section 508, and there's probably a bazillion more, and so forth. So let's ask why standards. I looked this up, and basically the dictionary definition, more or less, or what I found is like a common, term for why, or to answer this question was it provides a common language, right? It sets expectations and enables compatibilities. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of that, rule of thumb is like electricity and outlets and things like that. Even though that each country may have different types of things, but the basic common principles of the standards are, there's a positive, there's a negative, there's a ground, all those types of things. It never really deviates. And what that does is that provides like the institutional of common language to know how to build something or know how to work something or how to integrate it with the most amount of compatibility. Just imagine like if we didn't have standards, what type of like house you might live in, or what type of car you might drive in, or various other types of things. So really, this is so important to understand and how it can relate to what we do, whether you're in content or user experience or development. Those standards should be treated as like the rules, right? And we shouldn't deviate from that. And if you were to take away anything from this presentation, it really is basically this. So with standards becomes design patterns. Design patterns are reoccurring solutions that solve common design problems, right? So go back to the electricity thing, like an outlet or whatever, right? Like the plug. Like that follows a specific design pattern. I'm not talking about actually the plug itself, but you plug it in and it goes on, and you unplug it and it turns off, right? That's basically a foundational pattern in the most simplest terms, right? Things like other real life examples would be like streets. Think about it, a street. Whether they're in a rural setting or an urban setting, they inherently are made and act and behave the same exact way. There's left turns, right turns, straights, swervy roads, but there's really no major deviations from a particular pattern of how to create and how to leverage, and work in a street environment. Another one is buildings or houses. Houses and skyscrapers, they basically follow the same fundamental building process or design pattern. They first start with the foundation, then they go to the frame, then they go to the roof, and they go from there, right? You can't build a house, without starting at the foundation. It just won't last. So the pattern to follow is you understand how it's built, how it's used, how it matches up with those standards that are incorporated into the design pattern and so forth. This is my favorite one, and I'm hoping with the next couple of slides you'll all agree with me. But doors, right? So there's many ways to get in and out of a building, right? But think about it, okay? How do you use a doorknob, right? It's the same way. It's either you turn it or you pull it up and down. You either push or you pull to get in. There's different particular solutions to different particular types. But really, across the board, it's the same way, every single type of door, until you get to, well, this is the door, right? So a standard door. So you would open this by either pushing or pulling, right? And then if there was maybe the bar across, horizontal, you'd push or pull, or you turn a knob or whatever. But then came the idea of how do we improve upon a particular design pattern, like take a door. Is there a better way to do this? Is there a more efficient way to do it? So someone came up with this idea, right? So this is one of those revolving doors, right? And even though that there are two design patterns, push-pull or go around, this basically is a behavior that is, disseminated out. You learn it, you train it. Like when you walk up to one of these things, do you ever question which way to go in or how to wait for the next person to come out? Because the pattern is a solution to the problem of getting in. Now this pattern is basically been enhanced from the other one. Some of the things that it does is it may be simpler to use. It's faster. You don't necessarily have roadblocks. It's also energy efficient, right? So there's other things that you may be solving for in this particular design pattern, but it also might cause problems. Anybody think of a problem with these things? What?
Wheelchair.
Right, wheelchair, or you try and bring your luggage through them. It's difficult, right? So upon a design pattern, as innovators of various industries and things, we try and evolve and make those design patterns better, right? So what happens if we change the pattern? Hopefully everybody nods their head. Have you ever run into one of these? Especially at like IKEA, right? That's the big one that I always run into. So this is the next evolution of the revolving door design pattern. But have you ever walked through one of these and had a problem with how it worked? What, you're shaking your head. What's the problem with it?
Well, first of all, they go automatic. You don't touch the thing. And you start walking fast. It's not. Somebody else is getting on. I do.
Right. So I've had this similar experience. Like, I want to go through it faster. You know, I've seen 1,000 times people pushing on it, and all of a sudden it stops because it thinks it's an emergency push to actually like execute the emergency breakthrough of it. So this design pattern was evolved, but it might not have actually been thought through, or it might not have been disseminated well enough to actually educate people to know how to use it. So they have to stick these little yellow things on there and say, it's automatic, don't push, right? So one could argue that this is a new innovative way to think or do something, but maybe it didn't follow the native pattern of what it is that we are accustomed to or what we want to do. Now, I'm guessing over a period of time, these will become more popular and people will learn how to use them, but think about what we do in our businesses and we try and do something new or innovative or change the pattern, you end up with something like this. And I'm guessing everybody's had a problem one point or another with this particular design, right?
They're also very small. So that'll get you a lot of push.
True, but on the other hand, people with luggage and wheelchairs could actually go through them, right? So they might be solving one problem but creating another. And those are the types of thought-provoking things that as innovators or you know, user experience or content strategists or developers that you have to think through. And the best way to think through that is kind of like through first the standards and then the patterns. So how does this relate to inclusive design and accessibility? Well, before we answer that, let's test ourselves. So I've come up with some common things that I'm guessing we all do that we could probably all answer this. So how do we open a new page on our computer, like through our browser? What? Tab or
Command T.
Command T, that opens a tab. Command new or Control new, depending upon you're on a Mac PC, right? How do you quit a program? You know, Apple Q, you know, or Windows Q or whatever, right? These are things that are very, very common. You know, which button on a mouse do we use to select something? The left one, right? We know that. Even on a touchpad, it's a totally different design pattern, but it uses the same basic standards to mimic a similar pattern, right? How do we make something bold using the keyboard? You know, Control B, right? So basically, our industry or computers itself has set forth some examples of common things that they've vetted through, that they know they work, right? And they know people know how to use it, and you really don't have to, you know, train for it. You might actually like hover over the little B in Microsoft Word, and it'll tell you how to do it. And then for the next time, you know that it's going to come up, right? How do we navigate a web page? You know, like this one's to me simple, but do people that don't do what we do know this? Like they use the mouse, right? But how do you do it without the mouse? Do they know the standards, the base practices of navigating a website, you know, with it? You know, how do we use a module component? We're not going to answer that one because there's no real in-depth example. But like, think about the next time you design something or you build something. Is your module or component so intuitive that it follows the standards and design patterns so they know right away how to use it? They don't even have to think about it. So if we didn't follow standards and patterns, accessibility would be very difficult. I was kind of being PC in that. It would be, in my opinion, nearly impossible, right? So let's give some, you know, examples of how to make our work more accessible by following the standards and the design patterns. And here are some simple steps that we should follow. So even though that I'm in technology and most people in accessibility think that, you know, accessibility is a byproduct of the technology implementation portion of the project, but I believe it's the opposite. It actually should follow the same methodologies of building a house. It should start at the foundation, the blueprints, right? You have to vet to make sure that everything that's going to be proposed or that you're going to experience or interact with is accessible. So I believe asking the right questions, and the first place that I do it at is talk through the experience. So when I sit down with user experience folks, I basically, you know, ask them to explain the experience in layman's terms, not in technical design detail. It's like, what do you want them to do? How do you want them to interact with it? And an example would be is like the user will move their mouse and hover over a call to action. Then they click the call to action. Upon clicking the call to action, maybe a modal appears. You know, the user will interact with that modal, right? And then when they decide to close the modal, they'll move on. Well, that's the interaction, right? But how does that actually get translated into what it is that we're doing? So those are the questions that I will engage with people to make sure that they're actually able to explain it to me in the most simplest terms. A modal or a call to action is fairly simple, but let's just hypothetically talk about something like a new, you know, way to navigate or add to cart or shop or drag and drop, whatever it could be. Like, can they explain the experience to me in the most simplest terms? Those will usually lead to things that tell us about design patterns and standards. Then I basically say, okay, so now we've got the experience explained out, more of like the foundational point of view. I'll go to kind of like, you know, the decorating or the design elements of it. So I would likely sit down with the design team at that point, and basically I will ask them, you know, we expect designers to, you know, be creative and think like blue sky, like they want to be the most innovative, right? They want to be the most creative folks. But it's important for them in particular to understand the feature or the intent in addition to what it looks like. So my example is the designer wants to use a switch, right? Like an on-off kind of like toggle. You see them on mobile devices all the time, you know, but they might not fully understand both technically and experience what that switch actually is. Like, does everybody can they visualize an on-off like switch toggle, like, right? Most, I would say probably on the record, like 90+% of the time, a switch is a Boolean, right? In technical terms, that's on or off, yes or no, true or false, right? It's 0 or 1. And in that case, most times when you are switching with those terms in play, you're actually using a form, or you're submitting data, a yes/no answer or response. So it's checkbox. It's a simple checkbox, right? So if the designer doesn't know the intent of it, of how it's going to be implemented or how it's going to be interacted with, they may design a on-off switch that might not work the same way a checkbox will work. And that's a big problem. And we've probably seen it 1,000 times. Then we come to the technical aspect of it, and it's like, do we understand the implementation? So developers can read documentation and they can learn all the, you know, W3C standards and things like that, but it's often that the developer looks at like a set of wires or a Photoshop document and then just goes off and builds something, right? And understanding the design pattern to follow and the intent of the design element is the key to them successfully executing it with accessibility in mind. So take the switch, right? So like, you know, how do they, you know, implement the design but as a radio or a checkbox? Or how do they create this new fancy like custom, you know, drop down, like simple, you know, state selection, you know, UI, but they want it fancy with flags or with, you know, borders or whatever. Like, we can implement that, but if it doesn't follow the standards and it doesn't follow the design patterns, you won't be able to use it. And most actual, even backends won't be able to consume it. So it's really important for the developers to not just consume the documentation, but it's to understand the intent, the standards, and the design patterns, because that's where they will know which tags to use, which, ARIA, things like that and so forth. So I want to just show you some examples of where I think the industry at large has missed and has done well. Okay, so this is a little video. So hopefully you can kind of see it. You'll see my mouse move. So this is an example of a bad modal pattern. And just so I can throw them under the bus, this is jQuery.modal.com. So #1 in the search results, right? So what you'll see here is I'm tabbing. So I'm using the keyboard to go between links, and I click that call to action. And it's really hard to see because the screen's so dark. But when it opens again, I'm tabbing, and I'm actually tabbing the page links, not the modal links. So I can't actually interact with the modal at all. It's completely inaccessible. So it doesn't follow either the standards or the design patterns, which I'll get into a little bit later. Can everybody?
Sorry, I'm not clear what you're doing.
Okay, I'm going to show you really quick. So I'm using the keyboard only to get to this, and then I click enter. And it's really dark, but what you'll see is once the modal opens, you'll see this, it's moving in the background. But I'm not able to interact with the components within the modal. Like I can't actually click the close button, and I can't click the blue call to action inside of the modal, the close. So making that modal, correct.
Okay.
So someone with a visual disability in particular needs to use a keyboard, but someone like, let's say, with Parkinson's, they might not be using the mouse because of, motor disabilities, and they'll force themselves more structurally to use the keyboard. So this particular modal, if you implemented this on your website, it would be completely inaccessible to people with disabilities. On the other hand, I found a good one, which, believe it or not, I think this is Bootstrap. So this is, you call to action, and you'll notice now I'm actually interacting with the elements in the modal. Right? Can you see I'm tabbing the same type of thing, but once I'm opened, I'm now forced inside of the modal, and I have to make a decision to either act on it or close it. So this is an actual good design pattern. So basically, I listed out, you tab to the call to action, you click or enter to open it, you focus on the modal, which is the blue ring around the white box, you click tab, your tab locked inside, and then you can either close the modal or return to a call to action. That's the other key feature too, is when you close it, you return back to where you came from. So of a good design pattern with regards to a modal. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. So what I want to do here quickly, if this works, is I'm going to switch to my browser, which I think I did. Okay, and
that part's not straight.
oh, really? Even if I share the Hangout? Where's my Hangout? Hold on. Maybe I need to share.
Yeah, I think you have to. There.
How about that guy? Hold on. Okay, but I'm going to move this over so you don't see it twice. Whatever. Okay, so this is an example in actually the W3C. They linked to this, but this is like a tooltip. So let me go back here really quickly. So a tooltip. So according to,
Whenever you change.
All right.
screens.
maybe I won't change. Wait, where'd it go? Come on. Change screens. Technical difficulties. Entire screen. Okay. Well, this is the wrong screen, but that's okay. Well, we'll stick with this for now. Oh, what happened?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's looping them onto itself.
Yeah, that's just getting
Yeah, that's a issue with Hangout. I've experienced that.
That's why I stopped doing it.
Okay. Well, now you see my notes, but that's okay.
Those are not shared, just so you know.
Right.
Oh, here they are, but not.
Right. Okay, but so basically, this is according to the W3C, and at the bottom here, I linked to it. And this particular, example is with, tooltips. So a tooltip is like you hover on something and you get a little dialogue of sorts. So a pop-up that displays a description for an element when a user passes over or rests on the element, supplements to a normal tooltip, blah, blah, blah. But here's the key, right? So the triggering element to which the tooltip is attached, link, should never actually lose input or focus. So according to the W3C for a tooltip, there's a rule to be followed, right? And then the next one is if the tooltip is evoked when the trigger element gets focused, then it should be dismissed when it no longer has focus. So those are things that both user experience people need to know and developers need to know when they're actually like saying, hey, this is what it is that I'm going to represent. So let me try and switch here. I know I might have to go back. Okay, hold on. Okay, so you can see that. And now I'm going to become an expert at this soon. I think, if I can find my Hangout. Okay, that's cool, I think. I don't know, I have two screens. There we go. Okay, this will help. Come on. This was actually my intention on how I would fill up time.
Good job.
Okay. So we're sharing this, right? Okay. So everybody can see it. So this is an example of a tooltip. So I mouse over this field and it says, oh, your first name is optional. And I mouse over another field, your last name is optional. And it disappears. If I'm in the box, it stays there. If I leave the box, technically, oh, my mouse is still there. Okay. So when I switch between these tooltips are showing and hiding according to the spec. So this is key. So when someone goes and reinvents the wheel or thinks of another way to do it, the best place for everybody to start is back at the design pattern and the standards. Okay. Let me show you one more so I don't have to keep going back and forth between things. So here's another one on Bootstrap, right? So if I hover, it shows up on the left, and if I hover, it shows up on the right. Whatever. That's with the mouse. If I get to this component here, eventually you'll see I'm tabbing. I'm not using my mouse, and hopefully somewhere down here is a tooltip. Come on. Should have prepped it. This is a whole different discussion to have. But let's see here, toggles. Oh, I should just follow the thing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So you'll see that I'm tabbed on the tooltip on the right, and I tab back. I'm on the top of the bottom, the top, left, and if I go through, it shows and hides. It's a perfect example of following the spec. So there's rules to be followed and so forth. Let me show one more. Another tooltip, right? So if I come down to here, let's see, where is it? Did I pass it? Tooltips. So it's like this guy, right? So if I tab to these guys, it shows me. If I tab out, it goes to the next one, so forth. So again, a simple example of following the spec. Okay, let's go back to what? So we're talking about like the ability to interact with it right now, but technically making it accessible for screen readers is a whole separate step. So one thing I tell the people that I have auditing or that I say, hey, is this accessible or not? The number one thing I say is go use your keyboard. If you can't interact with it with your keyboard, I can pretty much guarantee you you're not going to be able to use it with a screen reader. So foundation, again, if you can't use it with a keyboard, you're likely not going to be able to use it with a screen reader. If you can use it with your keyboard, you got to go to the next level. It's like kind of like a video game. Okay, so now I got to go back to my Hangout, which I think is over here. Okay. Yeah.
So the fact that that is keyboard accessible means that the person on the screen reader won't get stuck inside the mobile, but it still doesn't mean that the mobile isn't useful.
So are you talking about the tooltip or the mobile? I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. So what was in this case it was the tooltip.
Right. So in this case, the tooltip. So the question was, again, just repeat it so I can.
So if navigating through it on a keyboard is not a problem, then yay, the person will doing that won't stuff like you did in the mobile. But if the tooltip doesn't read itself, then
So,
having it there is just a nuisance. It's something to navigate.
not necessarily, because think about it from, let's say, someone that's forced to use the keyboard but isn't visually impaired. They're going to use the keyboard to navigate through something, and they're going to want to know what that acronym is or whatever it is that the tooltip is. And because they can't use the mouse, they need to have that thing be visible, right? So that information is pertinent enough for them to access.
So this would be helping some group of keyboard.
Well, that's the baseline. So then if you take it to the next level of someone, let's say that's fully blind, okay, what you would do, which is getting a little bit deeper into the further parts of the presentation, is you can add extra elements like ARIA that will make it, the information, the supplemental information available verbally or auditory, audio-wise, right? So they won't ever see the tooltip, but they will know that when they tab to it, it says ABC has tooltip, and it'll say ABC is a XYZ, you know, whatever. It'll announce to them whatever you programmatically want to tell them.
If it's, I just didn't know
Yeah,
what happened.
no.
Because I've never tried it.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so that was a tooltip. Okay, this is my favorite one. And there's too much to read through here, but a date picker, right? I'm not gonna throw you under the bus, but I'm gonna use one of your competitors, okay? So a date picker is you have a field, right? And it says when do you wanna leave or what, you know, what's your birthday or whatever, and you tab into it and it says, oh, this big magical pop-up says with a calendar looking thing, right? Okay, so that's what a date picker is. And this goes into significant detail of what the spec and what the standards are of how that date picker should or shouldn't work. And to give you an idea, I needed 2 pages plus. I didn't even go down that, right? So I'll read a couple of these as an example so you have a good understanding. So basically, keyboard navigation on days that are not included in the currently displayed month should move to the month automatically and lead to the day in the next previous month. So basically, when you focus in, the highlight of the component should go to today. Okay, and then there's like tab. Like other widgets, the date picker receives focus by tabbing in. One focus is received, focus is repositioned on today's date in the grid of the days and weeks. A second tab will take the user out of the date picker widget. Focus initially is placed on today's date. So most date pickers don't follow that, and I'll show you that. Is when you tab and it focuses the date picker, if you hit tab again, it might actually start tabbing through the dates, which means you can never get out of it. Okay? So using something like Shift Tab reverses the direction of the tab focus, or up and down arrows. That allows you to actually pick supplemental dates. We'll get into that. Okay? And things like that. So there's a really, really long list, and I put down here, which you can't see in the presentation, a link to the spec. It's overwhelming. And I guarantee you that most UX people that are envisioning the next best date picker, which most airlines are usually trying to do because they want it easier, hotels in particular, I've gone through these conversations, they want to make it simple and intuitive, check in, check out, you know, departure, return, they want it really cool and really innovative, but they're never following the specs here. So I can't find a single one that follows the spec. And I looked. But I did, however, find some that do. Let's go show one. So let's get out of here. I'm going to go back to my little example, which I'm becoming an expert at this now. Come on. Okay, I want to share my screen. This guy. Okay, so, can everybody, oh, I'm not sharing? Okay. So let's go to this one, this fantastic one. Distributed by the largest JavaScript framework known to man, basically, okay? Everybody starts here. So I'm gonna show you what it looks like with a mouse first. So I enter in here, I get this fancy little date thing, I can go back and forth, and you know, I can pick the 17th, and I can do this, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? But now, let's try and use it with a mouse, okay? I mean, with a keyboard. If I hit tab, okay, and I tabbed number 1, but then it immediately closes, okay? So I hit tab, I can't use it. I hit the arrows, I'm hitting arrows, and all I'm doing is cycling through, the dates. The actual date picker module is not accessible. Should we try something else? Shift enter, okay, I'm just winging it with you, right? Shift enter, nope, okay. One could argue, and this is where the debates will typically happen, is that does the actual picker itself need to be made accessible? One could argue that I could just type my date in here, right? I'm not blocked by doing this with the keyboard. 1/1/2020, right? I didn't get the date picker. I was able to enter my date, but I'm not getting the same experience, so to speak. So that's where the debate will likely come in. But if you are going to try and create an inclusive design, one for all for one, you would likely want the date picker to be available to people with certain disabilities that could fast and easily use it, just like if I were to use it with a mouse. Bad example. Let's go to a good one. Oh, let's go to one this one's okay. Where is it? We're going to skip this one. So this is a pick a date. So I found a different plugin, right? So this one looks really cool, right? And I could click these arrows and I can pick a date. I can even go to today and I could, clear my entry, all that kind of stuff. Great user experience, so to speak. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but for a mouse user, it's fantastic, right? Okay, if I'm using it on a keyboard, I can actually use this, okay? It doesn't follow the spec because I can't do things like, shift enter or whatever, I don't memorize them, but like go from today's to the date from the previous month, but I can at least interact and go and use it. So it is a much better following practice of both the standards and the design spec. Okay, one more here, and this is where I apologize.
That's okay. You're actually validating everything.
Okay.
Here,
So if you guys want to see some really good accessibility, like I just started really nitpicking this site, it's very good, and it's getting even better. And I didn't realize that there was a standard or a timeline for all the airline, and now it makes perfect sense to me why this is so good, because I would have expected this to be bad. But so date picker, right? You get this cool thing, right? It's awesome. It shows me 2 months at a time, and I can go forward. I can go back with the mouse, and it shows me really visually like how awesome this thing is. If I use it with a keyboard, I'll get into the bottom part of this section in a little bit. But I can actually, if I remember, I don't remember the controls. Oh, so there I'm going. Okay, so I can go, forward. I can go down. I can actually go month to month if I get there, right? All these kinds of things. This is impressive. Okay, and there are actually, if we reviewed those design patterns according to ARIA, all of those are, or most of them are pretty available. The other thing which I'll highlight at the bottom is really impressive. So let me explain this quickly, and then I'll get into it in more detail. Notice how when I use my mouse, you don't see that bottom. But when I use my keyboard, I do. That's awesome, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Okay, let me go back to this guy. How do I get out of it? No. Screen share. Come on. Okay. Stop. Back to this. Okay, and now I'm going to go back here. Now I'm going to screen share. Sorry. How are we on time? Come on. I don't have much more. I do not have much more.
Okay. Then we're doing
Okay. Okay, so we couldn't find the specs. So now let's talk about ARIA, right? So this is like the technical thing that some of you may or may not be aware of, but ARIA is the Accessible Rich Internet Application Suite. Defines a way to make web content and web applications more accessible to people with disabilities. It especially helps with the dynamic content and advanced users interface controls developed with AJAX, HTML, JavaScript, and related technologies. So this is basically like a secondary language to what we do that helps code talk to assistive technologies and assistive technologies to talk to code. So all of those design patterns basically got augmented and got enhanced with ARIA. Okay? So understanding some basics. This is a little bit more technical, so let me know if you have any more questions, but like sight and mobility impaired users must be able to quickly access a list of landmarks for a web page to be used. So basically think of it as like a table of contents, right? So we want to define using landmarks code on the page that tells a user with various disabilities that there's a navigation, there's a side navigation, there's a search, there's content. We want to be explicit so they could, go to those areas with ease. Remember the examples of me tabbing, and trying to get to something? This prevents that because they can use assistive technologies and shortcuts to skip the navigation. We've all heard that, right? Skip to navigation when you first tab. This eliminates that. That you don't have to add some extra, visual and contextual. You could just basically add some code, and they automatically have this glorious, table of contents. Roles. So once you get landmarks, then you might want to specify, each particular thing. What is it? So like it's a banner, right? It's a main section. It's a navigation. It's a search. Imagine you trying to execute a specific task, and there's a lot of content on that page. This is a way for you to quickly access something without question of what it is. And this is something that really is very foundational. This takes a developer no effort whatsoever to implement. It just takes them to do it. So there's no advanced learning. It's just understanding what is available and going from there. And then we get into a little bit more advanced stuff. So states and properties. And this is really where our ARIA kicks in, right? So this is, prior to ARIA, there was no consistent bidirectional cross-browser implementation between assistive technologies and applications to communicate. So like, for instance, take my on-off switch, right? I could click it or I could tab it, but there was no way for a custom built switch to communicate with an assistive technology because there's that no standard, right? We are losing the communication gap. So ARIA allows us to do things like expanded or checked or selected or labeled by. There's a lot of that. So like take a toggle, right? Open, close. Well, it's expanded or it's not expanded. It's checked or it's not checked. We can build very creative experiences and visual designs now and use ARIA to bridge the communication gap between those technologies. There's so much to go into that I couldn't do it here, but to give you an example of where it can be applied is like, so take ARIA for content strategies. There's none in here, right? But one of the common things that they always complain about is click here or explore, or they want to be very simple and plain in their nomenclature of buttons in particular, right? So they can add contextual elements that are not visually there, but that are to the assistive technologies, using labeled by or described by. Or they can actually announce like what's actually happened. So it's hard to see, but in the case of Southwest, when I actually focus in to the box, this black area here is what the screen reader is actually reading. Okay, so it's reading, content selected, date depart in format, MMDD, valid dates from March 4th to November 4th, keyboard instructions, up, down, arrow, access the widgets, shift, right. Imagine coming to this for the very first time and not having that instruction. There would be no way for you to know how to use that unless you were following this design pattern to spec, which we've all clearly noticed. It's very hard to do. So content strategists can add contextual information to help for accessibility. So this is an example of where you can go the extra mile if the people are thinking about the intent. Another one is for UX folks, right? So Apple's a great example. They kill it when it comes to accessibility. So like what I'm doing is I'm using the search box, okay, using a keyboard. And the things that I noticed is they're using ARIA autocomplete to tell the user that while you start typing your search page, that basically a list of things are auto-completing. So you'll see that like it's giving me hints. It's telling me that that's actually happening. ARIA has pop-up. It told me that it's popping up with a new feature or so forth. So these are the things that the developers can implement without any question, but it's the user experience people to go back to that intent. How do I want them to use it? How do I want them to interact with it? If they don't tell the developers that, the developers won't necessarily know what ARIA to actually use. Okay? This is for the geeks in the room. The bad news for you front-end web developers is for you to do this right, developers not only need to utilize the appropriate ARIA roles, states, and properties, they also have to leverage and use JavaScript to help manage the constant flux of content, interactions, and states. Some of the things to think about when leveraging all the JavaScript are that sites using JavaScript typically will be fully accessible. There's been a lot of data to show that people, even with people with assistive technologies, they don't disable JavaScript anymore. So all of the screen readers and other assistive technologies are being incorporated with JavaScript enabled through ARIA and following those specs and standards. Ensure that your scripts are both mouse and keyboard enabled. A typical one is you'll use like a click handler. Well, a click handler is not a focus, right? It's not keyboard, that's click, right? You know, things like that. So you have to actually think about all the extra JavaScript that you will have to work with, especially, I think I heard someone talk about Ember. You know, like if you're talking about a single page application that is constantly changing in its state, this is going to be a lot of work. Leverage dependent and independent event triggers. This is relatively new actually, or at least I thought it's new, is that you can track if it's a click or a keyboard event. So go back to that Southwest example. They didn't show the additional help at the bottom if I used my mouse. But if I used my keyboard, it added actual content and context to the screen. So they're using independent and dependent triggers to differentiate between mouse and keyboard. So they're going like the extra mile, you know, with that type of philosophy. Managing focus and refocus. So like a good example is we always think about going somewhere, but if they close it or if they do like a negative action, does it take them back to where they were? Like one thing that I often find is like when I use like table of contents, if I click the table of contents, I get sent down to the bottom of the page, right? But what happens if I want to get back? There's no way back, right? You have to tab shift all the way through every single link to get back, right? There should be potentially a way to track where you came from and where you might want to go back, things like that. And then the biggest one is for you developers, read and follow the design patterns. I cannot emphasize that enough. There's so much, but that's really the only way to make the assistive technologies to be able to communicate to the browser is through the standards. Some don't follow them, some do, but at least we can, you know, go from the baseline. So here's an example of all of the design patterns that are already specified, right? Accordions, alert boxes, alert dialogues, autocomplete, buttons, checkboxes, combo boxes, date pickers, modals, drag and drop, grid. I mean, I'm guessing there might be a small percentage of user experiences out there that comes up with something brand new that you can't, I mean, I would be surprised if you can't correlate it back to this. So like, take an accordion, not an accordion, a carousel, right? There's no carousel in this, right? Well, let's think about it, break it apart. Buttons, content, links. Like each little piece of the carousel can be broken up into a standard. And that's really where you want to focus on both. I would say if you're a UX person, this is a great place to start, building that next best experience, but following the standard. Take the turnstile door, right? If you follow these, it'll be more easy to recognize, know how to work. You won't be pushing it. You won't be bouncing in because it's going too slow, whatever it may be. It's that. And then from the developer's point of view, this is the place that you really need to make sure, because if you don't follow these at least the majority of the way through, screen readers in particular won't be accessible. And that concludes the presentation. So, thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
So how does this impact mobile phone use?
Okay, so it impacts it, I would say, nearly 1-to-1. So if you're talking about native application, so your Facebook app, there's a lot more nuance and a lot more spec out there that hasn't been defined. But I would say that if you're talking about mobile web, so responsive design, screen readers on mobile phones are following the same standards as desktops are. And the design pattern, if you think about the analogy of roads or outlets or whatever, it's the same thing, right? A switch is a switch. A carousel is a carousel. Whether it's in a native app or on a web page, it's the same intuitive thing. The only thing that's different is how you interact with it. So if you're able-bodied, you might use swipe, right, for something, or touch or tap. If you're not, you use a screen reader that basically has to intuitively, communicate to whatever it is that it wants to do and what it should be doing. So if you have an iPhone, try your voiceover on it. It's awesome, and it does it really well. And you'll find that the sites or the apps that are following most of the patterns are the ones that you can actually use. So I would say that in most cases, it's a 1-to-1.
And then the second question
Sure.
is most of these things are JavaScript enabled. Is that correct?
No. So in the screen of where I had landmarks, roles, and then states and properties, landmarks and roles are pure HTML. They're just straight up HTML. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. The state changing, when you need to interact with it on a dynamic, element. So does everybody understand what stateless or state means? It means that it's either static or it can be a constant flux. If it doesn't have a state that it can change, you have to track that through JavaScript. So there are instances of sites out there that don't really leverage a lot of dynamically changing components and elements that you can make purely accessible with just some basic ARIA tags, roles, and landmarks.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I read somewhere that ARIA was rolled out prior to the release of HTML5, and a lot of the default HTML5 elements or landmarks actually have the ARIA capabilities within them.
Correct.
So would it be better to just try to, not be as redundant and just label elements that need the ARIA roles versus going through and labeling every
Correct.
landmarks?
Yeah, so in the instance of if I were to use the nav tag, right, which is navigation, you wouldn't need to add role navigation to it. You would not need to do that. But in the instance of, progressive enhancement and graceful degradation, when you have to accommodate a non-HTML5 browser, you then need to A, shim it. If no one knows what that is, I'll explain later. But B, basically add the role. And that's usually what the shim will do. But yes, generally speaking, you don't need to over tag. And the way to learn more about that is just what I do a lot now, which is a lot quicker and a lot easier, is I'll use a fiddle, a JS fiddle, or a code pen. I'll stick one tiny tag in that fiddle and I'll open up my screen reader. Rather than going through the whole page and figuring out the page, I will go component elements alone and hear it and learn from it and see if it actually works. So it's an extra step. It's kind of like a POC, right? A proof of concept. So that's how I'll do that. So you could go in and type a tag and test it and be like, okay, well, maybe that's not intuitive enough. I'm going to add something else.
We actually did something similar. We've had an ongoing debate between ARIA label by, and ARIA described by. We've had one of our UX folks in the requirements saying ARIA labeled by, and then the text they want to appear. For any of you who do not know ARIA labeled by and described by, they typically point to an ID which has the textual content that is described in the labeling. ARIA label actually contains the text string that is used as the label. But me, I knew that as being the fact, but the UX person who I'm collaborating with kept on saying, ARIA described by, and then the text. So I literally created just a flat HTML file with every variation of these three ARIAs used, and then we just listened to it in two different screen readers and said, "Ta." Right. But I think that's really what you have to do with ARIA. In our initial requirements, the requirements folks next to every link would say role equals link, and I'm like,
Yeah, I mean,
why all that extra work?
there's intent for each of them, right? And understanding the intent of them could sometimes be ambiguous. But just for front-end developers, when to use an ID and when to use a class, or when to use a data selector, all these types of things come into the discussion. There is original intent behind those attributes and parameters. And if you stick to the original intent, you will likely succeed more across a wider range than if you change it. For instance, I could not use any class or ID on any div or any element ever, right? And I could use data selectors, and I could manipulate it and manage the page any way I wanted to. It's possible. Should you? No. So you want to try and research back to the intent of the littlest nuance to ensure that the widest range of things are actually working. So labeled by would widely be used for a one-to-many relationship. So you have one description, this link opens in a new window, but you have 10 links on the page. So those 10 links will have labeled by and that one ID, like Dennis said, and you are leveraging a better experience and a better code base to do it as well. Yeah.
How different would you say the experience is between different screen readers as compared to the same
I'm glad you asked. I would say that it is the same paradigm as between Safari, Firefox, Mozilla, IE, Chrome. It is just a different browser. I mean, essentially what it is. So NVDA doesn't do exactly what JAWS does. JAWS doesn't do what VoiceOver does. They're all trying to follow the specs, but they all behave differently.
One thing I'll say about that from just the experience I've had in the last 6 to 8 months is it's also a difference between platforms. So your Windows screen readers, NVDA, JAWS, handle things in a similar manner. JAWS is more robust than NVDA. Safari, being on a different platform, actually reads it down in a different manner. Therefore, certain things that may work in JAWS and NVDA does not seem to work in Safari. It doesn't mean that Safari is broken, it's just that it does it differently. From my experience, Safari and VoiceOver are the most strict combination that you can use. So, if you don't know whether something works or not, try it in Safari and VoiceOver first, then move on to your Windows platform.
Right, and it's also a paradigm between which screen reader or assistive technology you're using and which browser you're using.
Don't use Chrome.
Right? So for instance, if you're using VoiceOver and you're using Chrome, it won't work as well as if you're using VoiceOver with Safari. Or if you're using JAWS with Firefox versus JAWS with IE.
So I know for our framework that we're say, we're using Firefox and NVDA, that's the combination we're supporting. But we get similar results if you use Chrome, use Firefox. You know what I mean? If you're using Windows, like, those are the ones, but we don't actually support or fix bugs if the QA guys come back and say it's IE and NVDA is doing this sort of thing. And we're like, well, yeah, it's like HTML emails, where you have to write 1,000 different lines of code just to get it to do the same thing in Outlook or Gmail or Yahoo. So we had to actually pick one and say that's what we're supporting to be compliant. You guys have to use this. Sorry, but until they standardize better, we can't.
So how are the airlines doing with the government bringing that?
So two things.
What's their standard?
Right, so, well, they're not telling us.
Well,
Go figure. So two things. One, WebAIM, which is a website, webaim.org,
Yep.
they have an annual screen reader survey. Check out the survey. The last one was last July. They'll be doing another one soon. And they tell you the combinations of browser screen reader. And it actually changed big time last year because the folks who run Windows Eyes, they actually announced to their users that, hey, there's a survey going on, and NVDA dropped, clear into second to last place, and Windows Eyes was second to JAWS. But you'll get a feel for how actual screen reader users are using the tools with which browsers and such. So that's definitely a great resource. Now, how are the airlines handling it?
I mean, someone's gonna come back and judge you, right?
Yes, and that is the users. So it's been a roller coaster. It's been an emotional roller coaster in the last year because DOT's not telling us what they're going to do. First we thought, they're going to hire auditors, and what's going to happen is when users find an issue, they won't come to us. They'll go to the DOT. The DOT will file a complaint with us. We have, however long, we don't even know what the grace period is, but we will have, however many weeks to fix that particular problem, or else we'll be fined $27,000 per instance per day.
The thing to keep in mind, and I'll kind of go back to the original question, is so A, if you are in a position to make a choice of what requirements you have, just like any sort of requirements, you follow the numbers. So JAWS is 75% of the screen reader market out there. Okay? So by using Chromebox as a good example, it's 0%. So it's a testing tool.
Yeah, it's a testing tool. We actually thought that it would be great for our developers because it's handy. Experience has told us that it works completely differently. As well as Chrome in general works differently with any screen reader. And we're heavy Chrome users for development, but when it comes time to using the screen reader, we'll open up Firefox and NVDA or IE and JAWS and work that way.
But just like you would do in a normal QA cycle, right? So a critical mass, we test every browser that meets our clients or the industry's requirements, right? So when it comes down to it, we can't guarantee that it'll work in every single browser or every single device or every single, orientation. It's not possible. But we can do our best, right? And our best, the easiest way to achieve the best is to follow the specs. And I will say that in my experience, JAWS and VoiceOver and NVDA, they all behave very, very similar from a code perspective. You just might need to know the nuances of how to access that, as a tester. So your testers might actually not know how to use the devices or the assistive technology well enough and they'll get false positives. So just like I did an example, right? I pulled up Southwest and I couldn't figure it out, and I was like, oh, okay, that's how it is, right? It was eventually accessible once I remembered the right types of things to do. So your testers have to really know the devices that they're using to test on. Just like, mobile phone or desktop. You test differently from a mobile phone to a desktop, right? You test differently from NVDA to JAWS, JAWS to VoiceOver. So if you're doing the full gamut, it's part of the biz, so to speak.
Dennis? The feds there's no way the feds are gonna be able to tell you what the standards are. Because they don't know. They're not gonna do the research, it's not what they're trying to know. Right. They're gonna assign you, and tell you, make the customers happy. And you don't fill out the feds. It's working.
Exactly.
So,
There's a question back over here.
Yeah, that shows us that there's actually a standard of compliance, similar to like,
So yes, so that is the W3C created WCAG 2.0, which is relatively recent, and then there's 3 levels within that. So that's the standards that basically both the browsers are following and the assistive technologies are trying to mimic towards. But as we all know, browsers and companies and businesses like to make their own little nuances. And they don't always follow the standards, right? And that's why we have, like, in CSS, we have, like, you know, Mozilla, you know, hyphen Mozilla, because they wanted to do something before the standard was finished or before there was a standard, right? So every browser and every assistive technology, they all try and follow a certain set of rules, but this is not a perfect utopia, so that rarely ever happens.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. What was the name of it?
There's a Slack chat. Join.
Yes.
Accessibility questions and answers from people who are on specs, so it's helpful.
So that's helpful. That, I believe that's started by Stephen Faulkner, who contributes to the spec for ARIA. But also on webaim.org,
Forums.
their forum. Let's put it this way. I joined the International Association of Accessibility Professionals last year, primarily for the forums. I did not renew because WebAIM and their forums, which are free, are almost richer for my particular needs. It's a little antiquated because it's like driven by email, so it's like, but if you want to learn, like, you know, I started a thread however many months ago, a button versus a link. And then actually the information I was receiving, which was from like Stephen Faulkner from W3C and Leona Watson and such, they were contradicting the advice we were being given by an agency. And that was helpful because I actually, you know, have a high level of respect for these particular people. They basically said code to spec, let the assistive technology catch up, which sounds like what, 8 years ago? Yeah. So it's just history repeating itself.
Feels like
Cool.
Okay, well, once again, Seth,
Yeah,
thank you so
thank you.
very much.
Yeah, thank you. You can email me with any questions.